Hey, I'm Chelsea of Friday Pattern Company, and today we're doing a sew along for the top of the Saturday skirt set. We're going to divide the skirt and the top into two separate videos. So this sew along is for the top. We'll have a separate video going live on the same day for the skirt, so we'll link that below. And yeah, before you start the sew along, you should pick out your size, cut out your pattern pieces, and then we'll go through each of the steps. Let's get started making our top. On each of your pieces, you're going to snip in a 1/4 inch at all of the notches. These are matching reference points that you'll use when assembling the garment. So you just make a little snip that you can see on your pattern. You're also going to fuse interfacing onto the wrong side of one of your collar pieces, and you'll just follow the instructions on your interfacing to fuse that on. Starting with our top back B piece, we are going to press the hem edge under 3/8 of an inch. Then you're going to press it under another 3/8 of an inch, and then you'll take it over to your sewing machine and you're going to edge stitch this hem in place. A couple tips for edge stitching. One is that you can move your needle over to the left or to the right so that when you're trying to sew close to a folded edge, you can still have your project underneath your foot, but your needle is closer to that folded edge rather than having it over to the side where sometimes it'll get pulled down into your feed dogs. Anyway, so here is edge stitching the hem, and you're just sewing 1/8 of an inch from that folded edge. And here's your finished back hem. Next up, we're going to prep our collars. So you're going to grab your 2 collar F pieces and pin them right sides together around the 3 outer edges. So the 2 diagonal short ends and then the long edge across the top is where you're going to sew, and you'll use the 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once you have that sewn, we're going to clip the corners off, and then we'll trim down the seam allowance a little bit so that when we flip this right side out and press it, we get a nice clean finish. And here's our collar after we've flipped it right side out and pressed it. Next up, we're prepping our tie extension pieces, which is kind of the same concept as how we sewed the collars together. So you have 4 of them, and you're going to sew them right sides together into 2 tie extensions. You're going to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew around the outer edge of the tie extensions, leaving that short straight end open. And here those are sewn up. Now we are going to trim down the seam allowances again, and we're also going to clip the curve going around the outer end of the tie extension. And you do this by taking little notches out of the seam allowance so that when it's flipped, there's less bulk there. So what I do is I do diagonal snips going around the outer edge, and then I come back in the opposite direction doing diagonal stitches in the other way, and that just notches it all out. But you can go and kind of snip around however it feels comfortable to you. Now you're going to flip your tie extension pieces right side out and press them. So I do this by kind of sticking my thumb in and inching it down to the end, and then you can kind of pinch it and flip it right side out. And then you're just going to give it a good press, and you'll repeat that with both ties. Now we're going to attach the front to the back, which is exciting because this is where it starts to look like a shirt. So at the shoulder seams, we are going to pin our pieces right sides together, and we'll sew that with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then we're going to finish the seam and press it towards the back, and we'll repeat that on both sides. Here is that step finished, and I used a serger to finish my seams. You could use a zigzag stitch or whatever your preferred method is. Next, you'll do essentially the same thing with your facing pieces. So at the shoulder seams, you're going to sew your front facing to your back facing with right sides together, and then you're going to press this seam allowance open. Next up, we are going to finish the unnotched edge of the facing, so all the way around on both sides, and you can use whatever stitch you've been doing to finish your seams, a serger, a zigzag stitch, or if you have binding, you can also bind this outer edge. Cool, so we'll set our facing pieces aside for now, and we are going to attach the collar to the neckline of our top. So grab your front back pieces, and we will pin the collar right side to the neckline. The interface side of your collar should be facing down, and you are going to match the center notches on your collar with the center back notch on your bodice, and I like to match that, and then I'll match the notches on the front with the end of the collar. And then once you have those reference points matched up, you can kind of work the collar out to pin it in a few more places. You're going to take this over to your sewing machine and use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew it in place. Here is that last step finished, and now we are going to add the facing. So we're going to make a collar sandwich by pinning the facing to the top with the collar in the middle. And you'll do this by matching notches, and then you're also going to be pinning all the way around the center front as well. Then you're going to take this to your machine and sew it using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Here that is finished, and the next step is to sew along this bottom edge on the front of your bodice. So we're just going to sew 3/8 inch from the bottom all the way across on both sides. And here that is finished. Next we're going to slip the tie extension in here. So you are just going to squish it down through the trunk on the front of your bodice, and you can attach a safety pin and use that to help you kind of inch it down in there, and you'll pull it through until you match up the notches on the end of your tie extension with the notches on the end of your front piece. And then you're going to sew down that edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you'll repeat it on both sides. And here's what that step looks like finished. So now you're going to clip the corners on that seam you just sewed, and then you'll work your way around the bodice, clipping curves and corners, and then we're going to flip the facing around to the wrong side, and we'll press. You can use something kind of pokey to make sure that the corners around your collar come out nice and crispy. And yeah, just work your way around the entire bodice until everything looks tidy and nice. Next, we'll anchor the facing by matching up the shoulder seams on the facing and the top, and we are going to stitch in the ditch to secure the facing in place. So I just match those up really nicely and pin them, and then you can actually sew this on your machine from the right side, and if you go slow, you can just sew over pins. I mean, some people don't want to take this risk, but with these little short stretches, I'll do it just to make sure everything is secured perfectly in place. Next up, we'll join front to back at side seams. So right sides together, pin your front to back at side seams, and then the facing on the front piece is going to wrap around the hem of the back piece. So match the seam where the facing is joined to the front with the bottom of the hem of the back, and then wrap the facing around the back piece, and then the seam allowance is going to be pressed towards the front, and then you'll repeat that on both sides. So you'll sew down that side seam using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then you're going to finish that seam however you've been finishing your other seams, and then you're going to flip it right side out, and it creates this nice little finish where your front and back are joined together. Now we're going to pre-press our sleeve hems so that when we actually hem them, it'll make it really easy. So you'll press the hem edge of your sleeve under 1/4 of an inch, and then you'll come back through and press it under another 1/2 inch. And then you're going to repeat that on both sides, and this will then be unfolded, but our press marks will be there for later on down the road. They'll come in handy. Now you're going to add gathering stitches to the top of your sleeve piece. You do this between the outer single and double notches, and you use a long straight stitch. I use 5 millimeters, and you sew a 1/4 inch from the edge of your fabric, and then sew another line of stitches a 1/4 inch from that, and you want to make sure you leave your thread ends long so that you can pull on them later when you need to gather them in. Now, right sides together, we'll fold our sleeve in half, matching the underarm seam, and we're going to pin that in place. You make sure that you unfold your pre-pressed hem at this point, and then you will sew down this using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then you're going to finish it. Make sure to switch your stitch length back to a normal stitch length, because a lot of times after you've added gathering stitches, you forget, and then you're like, oh dang it, this is all coming undone. So, hot tip. Here that is finished with the seam finish and everything, and you'll repeat that on both sleeves. Okay, it's time to set in our sleeves. So right sides together, you're going to pin your sleeve into your armhole, and the single notch on the front of your sleeve is going to match with the single notch on the front of, or on your arm side, and the underarm seams of the sleeves will match, and then the double notch on the back will match with the double notch on the back arm side of your bodice. I like to get all of the notches matched up and pinned in place before I work on the upper part of the sleeve, where you're going to actually be pulling in on those gathering stitches to ease the sleeve into the arm side. On the upper part of the sleeve, you have a notch that matches with the shoulder seam, so you can match those up, and then you'll pull on the gathering stitches on your sleeve so that you gather it in to match the length of the arm side of your bodice. And once you do that, you can kind of move the gathers around with your hands so that they're distributed evenly, and then you'll pin that in place. And then you'll take this over to the machine and sew it using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then you're going to finish this seam and repeat on both sides. Then you can flip that right side out and remove any visible gathering stitches that you might be able to see on the right side of your sleeve. And then we'll move on to the sleeve hems. Because you pre-pressed your sleeve hems, this should be pretty easy, but basically you're going to secure this edge in place, and you can repress it if you need to. You're going to sew around the hem of your sleeve, leaving a 2-inch opening for us to run elastic through. And here's that finished, and that is going to be repeated on both sleeve hems. Now you're going to take the length of wristband elastic that you cut. There's guidance for how long this piece should be in the beginning of the instructions. You can attach a safety pin to one end, and then we're going to run this through the sleeve hem opening. So you stick it into that opening that you left in your seam, and then just inch it around the hem of your sleeve, being careful not to let that loose end pull into the sleeve, because then you'll have to start over. Once you make it out the other side, you can pin your two elastic ends together, overlapping them a 1/2 inch. And then I just like to double check that my elastic hasn't twisted anywhere inside of the sleeve hem. So you kind of feel around for that. And if it feels good, you're going to take it over to the sewing machine and use a zigzag stitch to sew the two ends together. Here's the elastic sewn together, and now you can just pull that back into the sleeve hem, and then you will sew that little opening that you left shut carefully on your sewing machine, and repeat that on both sleeves. Woohoo! So there are your finished sleeves, and technically you're done with the top. The optional last step that you have is to top stitch the facing in place, because it is loose inside of here, and if that's going to bother you, then we can secure it in place. You'll start with the back facing, and you're going to use a lot of pins to just make sure everything is laying flat and pin it in place. And then once you have it pinned around the back and then around the fronts, you can take it to your machine and edge stitch it all the way around. And then give it a good press, and you're done for real. Here is the finished top, and I'm so happy with how it turned out. This is a rayon fabric, so it has more of like a drapey, groovy, blousey vibe, but you could do more structured fabric, or, you know, play around with different things, tying it different ways, layering it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and happy sewing!